and George so close to pole. So definitely a confusing result in terms of he had one problem, I had another problem, and I had zero pace. He was at least able to hold on to him for a while.
Everyone saw the name at the top of the timing screens. Almost nobody noticed the team that quietly walked away with something far more valuable. Sprint qualifying created a headline, but buried beneath the celebrations was a discovery that could reshape the entire weekend. Because the biggest winner wasn't necessarily the driver starting first, it was the team that finally unlocked answers it had been searching for all season. Sprint qualifying always compresses Formula One into pure intensity. One practice session, limited setup changes, then straight into qualifying. Every decision becomes a gamble because there is almost no time to recover from a mistake. That's why everyone immediately focused on pole position. Fastest lap, biggest celebration. Another impressive performance under pressure. But inside the garages, engineers weren't celebrating lap times nearly as much as they were studying long-run data, tire temperatures, and driver feedback. And that's where the real story began. Ferrari arrived knowing outright speed had never been their biggest question. The SF25 could produce impressive qualifying laps, but converting that speed into consistent race pace had been much more complicated. Lewis Hamilton was still adapting to the team's braking characteristics, energy deployment, and front-end balance, while Charles Leclerc continued searching for a setup that protected the tires without sacrificing rotation through slower corners. Sprint weekends are often considered chaotic, but for Ferrari they can become unexpected experiments. With only one practice session available, teams are forced to trust simulator data much more than usual. If the simulator matches reality, confidence grows immediately. If it doesn't, the entire weekend becomes damage limitation. This time, Ferrari's confidence appeared very different. The timing sheet suggested they weren't the outright stars of sprint qualifying. However, several sectors hinted at something much more important. The car looked remarkably stable through medium-speed corners where tire loading usually exposes weaknesses. Instead of fighting rear instability on corner exit, both drivers appeared able to apply throttle earlier without overheating the rear tires. That might sound like a small detail. It isn't. Modern Formula One is often decided by tire degradation rather than peak speed. A car that sacrifices 0.2 over one qualifying lap may recover far more during 20 race laps simply because its tires remain inside their ideal operating window. Engineers constantly balance mechanical grip, aerodynamic efficiency, and thermal management. Finding that balance is incredibly difficult. But Ferrari wasn't telling the full story. Radio messages hinted that both Hamilton and Leclerc felt increasingly comfortable with the balance as fuel loads increased. That is exactly the opposite of what Ferrari experienced at several earlier rounds, where promising qualifying performances faded once the tires entered longer stints. Mercedes also quietly impressed. While many fans focused on headline positions, Mercedes appeared to prioritize understanding its revised setup philosophy. Throughout the season, the team has struggled to keep tire temperatures consistent, especially when track conditions change rapidly. During sprint qualifying, their car looked significantly calmer over aggressive curbs and directional changes. That points towards something engineers value enormously: predictability. Drivers can only attack when they trust the car beneath them. If the rear axle behaves differently every lap, confidence disappears. George Russell and the Mercedes engineers have repeatedly discussed needing a wider operating window instead of chasing one perfect setup. Sprint qualifying suggested they may finally be approaching that goal. However, another team complicated the picture. McLaren once again looked exceptionally clever with tire preparation. Their outright lap may not have stolen every headline, but the way they generated grip during the opening sectors revealed outstanding tire management. Rather than extracting everything immediately, the tires appeared to build performance progressively through the lap. That usually indicates careful preparation on the outlap, combined with suspension settings that avoid overheating the rubber before the flying lap even begins. It's one of those invisible advantages television rarely explains. Tires don't simply provide grip because they're warm. They must reach an incredibly narrow temperature window across the surface and deep inside the construction. Too cold, and grip disappears. Too hot, and degradation accelerates almost instantly. McLaren has become one of the strongest teams at managing that balance. Then something unexpected happened. Lewis Hamilton's feedback after sprint qualifying attracted attention inside the paddock. Instead of focusing purely on lap time, discussions centered around confidence under braking and consistency through multiple corners. Those comments matter because Hamilton has spent months adjusting to Ferrari's entirely different driving philosophy after so many years with Mercedes. Every Formula One car rewards different habits. Some require aggressive steering inputs, others demand patience before applying throttle. Brake migration settings, differential behavior, and energy deployment all influence how naturally a driver can attack a corner. Hamilton's gradual adaptation has sometimes looked frustrating from the outside, but sprint qualifying suggested another important step forward. That's where things became even more interesting. Ferrari's engineers have quietly continued refining aerodynamic balance rather than introducing dramatic upgrades every weekend. Small changes to floor edges, diffuser airflow, and beam wing efficiency rarely generate headlines, but together they influence how stable the rear of the car remains at different speeds. When airflow remains attached underneath the floor, downforce stays predictable. When airflow separates, the driver suddenly loses grip. Those tiny aerodynamic improvements often create larger gains over race distance than over a single qualifying lap. Red Bull also enters this equation. For years, Red Bull's greatest strength has been producing enormous downforce while keeping tire degradation under control. Their ability to rotate the car without overheating the rear tires became the benchmark across Formula One. If Ferrari has genuinely narrowed that gap, even slightly, it changes strategic possibilities throughout the sprint and Grand Prix. Because strategy only works if the car allows it. An aggressive undercut requires tires that switch on immediately. A long first stint demands excellent degradation. Flexible race strategy begins with predictable performance. Sprint qualifying hinted Ferrari may finally possess more than one strategic option. Meanwhile, telemetry comparisons likely became some of the most valuable files inside every garage. Engineers don't just compare maximum speed. They examine steering traces, throttle application, brake pressure, minimum corner speeds, and energy recovery. Those invisible numbers reveal whether performance comes from driver brilliance or genuine car improvement. In Ferrari's case, the trends looked encouraging: earlier throttle application, more consistent corner exits, reduced steering corrections, less tire overheating. Each improvement appears small on its own. Together, they can transform an entire race. The championship picture also makes these details impossible to ignore. Every sprint weekend offers limited opportunities to solve fundamental weaknesses before points are awarded. Teams capable of learning faster than their rivals often gain momentum that lasts several races. Development in Formula One rarely arrives through one magical upgrade. It comes through dozens of tiny discoveries that eventually combine into meaningful performance. And that may be exactly what sprint qualifying revealed. Yes, pole position deserved the applause. Yes, the fastest lap created the headlines. But hidden underneath those numbers was a far more significant story. Ferrari may have discovered a setup direction that finally aligns Hamilton's driving style with Leclerc's confidence, while simultaneously protecting the tires that have repeatedly limited their race pace. Mercedes found encouraging signs of stability. McLaren reminded everyone why tire preparation remains one of its greatest weapons. Red Bull suddenly has more rivals asking difficult questions. That's why the biggest winner wasn't simply the driver at the top of the standings. It was the team that left the session understanding its car better than it did just a few hours earlier. And in modern Formula One, that kind of victory often matters far more than a single lap. Because championships are rarely decided by who looks fastest on Friday. They're decided by who uncovers the right answers before